Director of Educational Research at CoQuest Advisors, and what's probably most of interest to this group is that I'm also an adjunct professor here at DePaul University, where I teach what is probably the only known accredited course on managed futures in the country, possibly the world, possibly the galaxy. And with that, I wanted to introduce Dorothy Cywinski. So Dorothy is manager of risk management group at NFA, where her operational objectives include managing a team of analysts who use qualitative and quantitative methods to identify assets and evaluate the membership population whose objective is to propose riskiest members firms for NFA examinations. She's worked at NFA for 12 years across various groups, with the last 6 years spent building out and developing NFA's risk management processes. Objectives. Dorothy is a member of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners and holds project management professional certification. She's passionate about risk, data visualizations, and leveraging data for insights, so feel free to talk to her about any of those. And just before she starts, I want to add one more thing. So, because you don't have enough things. She's also very graciously come into my classroom several times and talked to my students about regulation, compliance, red flags about managers. There's some things that she's talked about that really kind of stood out. And I said, you have to come to NIBA, you have to tell this to the audience. There's some really cool things. There's a wheel that she talks about and everything. So with that,
thank you,
Dorothy.
Thank you, Mark, so much. Hello. Thank you all for having me here. NIBA, thank you for having me here. I'm really passionate to speak about risk. I've been in NFA for quite some time, and I am more than happy to share with you what our risk management process has grown to be today. Mr. Malamed mentioned, you don't sit on your laurels. When things were working, when I think back to 2009 and we noticed, a lot of sales solicitation issues or sales practice issues within the industry, you kind of don't stand there and continue on with that, because the industry continues to evolve, crime continues to evolve, and so you need to evolve with it. So with that, I'd like to speak a little bit about the risk management group, our core mission, our functional overview. I will try to give a very brief history to present overview of our quantitative and qualitative oversight, as well as what our NFA examination process is. I will start by a show of hands. How many of you have experienced an NFA exam or have been part to an NFA exam? Okay, as I expected, majority of firms. Our membership population is about 3,600 firms, and we examine about 550 to 600 firms a year. So without a doubt, you will be examined. Part of our NFA mission is also to ensure compliance with CFTC regulations for our membership, as well as to provide some member services. So, all right, as far as our group is concerned, our mission is quite simply stated, not as simple to execute. Obviously, continuously identify, assess, evaluate, and monitor our membership population. And I'll speak a little bit to what that means. But more importantly, to prioritize and relay the riskiest firms to our exam teams to be able to examine. I'll start out with telling you a little bit about our team. Risk-based examinations at NFA are not a new concept, despite the fact that we have evolved in terms of how we identify firms today. Specifically what I mean is we've always done some sort of risk-based assessment of our membership population. For example, I mentioned sales solicitation cases a couple seconds ago. What that means is we probably went out to a firm and we've identified certain characteristics at that firm that caused us to take a case, and then we took those characteristics and looked at the rest of our membership population. Does anyone else exhibit those characteristics? I call that a manual logistic regression. So that's what we used to do, and that's a risk-based assessment of your membership population. But as we continue to evolve, and really right around 2014, we thought, there's got to be a better way. And what that means is there's got to be a more systematic way in which we can highlight those characteristics of problematic firms and be able to perhaps predict which other members that we have today exhibit those same characteristics and would pose problems. And so What we've done is we've evolved in that particular way from what used to be called, we used to call it a subject matter expert model. And that was truly what I just mentioned, which is we identified something that was a problem at one firm, and we thought, oh, 75% loss is a risk. We took a case against this firm because perhaps there were some trading concerns or disclosure concerns, and let's take a look at anyone else that is exhibiting those same characteristics. And while that model sounds good in practice, it might not necessarily apply, because a 75% loss for a firm that is using a tail strategy might be expected. Our group consists of 10 members right now. We have the majority of our group's members, and I wrote them down, so I'll hold them off the top of my head. So we have a combination of computer science, math, and business skills. That's obvious, but we have 3 staff that have taken and achieved their MS in predictive analytics from Northwestern, with 2 who are currently in the program. And those who are not or have not gotten that degree are taking other types of classes to understand, predictive analytics and business analytics, as well as data analytics. We have 8 staff who have worked in other areas within NFA, and I think that makes us unique and attributes to a lot of our success in terms of being able to identify firms. What I mean by that is we have that business wherewithal to be able to say, okay, what type of data do we have in disclosure documents that might be useful? What type of data are we collecting within our exam software that might be useful? What type of data do we have in financial filings that might be useful? And then 7 of our teammates are former examiners as well. So they have that understanding of how we interact with firms and what it is that we actually obtain versus what it is we can obtain. So the methods we use, which I will delve into a little bit, are quantitative, so models, alerts, and ad hoc analyses. I'll speak to those. And then I call this a qualitative overlay, which is validating those outputs for models using some sort of data validation assessment, prioritization, conveyance, extremely important. And this one, which doesn't seem to be spoken about too much, but I think re-evaluation is hugely important. So that circle in a risk management cycle to be able to get feedback to see what's working versus what is not. So this is an image I use quite frequently to convey how RMG, our risk management group, acts as a hub of information. So we have various sources within which we capture data. Most of you are very familiar with financial statements, disclosure documents, but things like, the day-to-day work that our staff do, calls that firms make to NFA and that we receive, investigative matters that we open, that's all data, questionnaire information. And I'm just going to do a quick little plug here, and that is, it is extremely important for you to answer questions to the best of your abilities and to the best of your accuracy to ensure that the information you're providing to NFA is accurate. And one thing I just want to mention with that is, your annual questionnaires are only due once a year, but we do have a sentence on that page that asks you, if you materially change your operations, please let us know. That actually helps quite a bit in understanding and painting a picture of the firm's operations. So for example, if you lost an AP and your customer count went down, a lot of times that helps perhaps explain why that happened. Versus if we don't see those data points moving in tandem, we might not be able to know. These are some of the, like I said, some of the areas from which we capture data points, arbitration, other data sources. Other data sources could be things like customer complaints that come through our door, or observations throughout our organization in other departments or in other groups that could be relayed to the risk management team. All right, so from a predictive modeling standpoint and overview, it's a very simple concept, again, not as simple to execute, but learning from past exams to predict the effectiveness of resources attributed to current exam. What that means is we are trying to identify, like I said a little bit earlier, characteristics of problematic firms we've had in the past and identifying firms that seem to exhibit those same characteristics today. Because what we do know for a fact is we have 3,667 members as of yesterday, but we only have X number of staff. So we have finite resources, and we want to ensure that we are going to the right firms so that those of you that are trying to run your business are running your business while we are obviously trying to identify instances of rule violations elsewhere. So currently we have a CPO, CTA, IB, and GIB model, and some of you might ask, well, where's the FCM model? We built an FCM model, but it is an index-based model because what we've noticed is, our FCM population has somewhat dwindled in the last, is that a good phrase to say? Somewhat dwindled in the last decade, let's say. So currently we do have an FCM model, but like I said, it is an index-based model versus the CPO, CTA, IB, and GIB models are predictive models. And I identify here, some of the terms and fields under which they fall, which is predictive analytics, machine learning, data mining, data science, artificial intelligence. And so the individuals that I mentioned that have the predictive modeling degree are basically using various predictive models in order to identify these firms. So for some of our, and I'll just mention, for one of our registration categories, we have a straight logistic regression model, and it seems to be working very, very well. Whereas for another registration category, we might actually have 3 different types of model techniques that are then overlaid together within programming software to be able to give us an output. So it's not extremely easy when trying to translate to someone, well, what are those risk factors? Certainly with a logistic regression, you could say, well, these 11 factors seem to be an indicator for risk. However, you can't really point to any specific risk factor because it's not any risk factor that causes the risks, it's the risk factors together, if that makes sense, hopefully. So similarly, for that modeling technique that I said where we have multiple models, you can have a model such as a decision tree model, which is a straight model that says, okay, this is the most predictive factor, and then it splits yes or no versus maybe a cut point over assets under management or whatever the case may be. I'm just using that as an example. Versus another one which could be something called a, I forget what it's called right now, but it's also a random forest. That's the name of it. It's a random forest where you have multiple models that are creating outputs that are then aggregated together. So that's what we are doing in terms of predictive and our predictive model overview. I mentioned that our predictive models are trying to find characteristics of firms we have had problems with in the past and apply them to firms we have had we potentially might have problems with today. So without a doubt that you can kind of draw the conclusion that the model is then built on past exam outcomes. So where have we taken cases? What types of findings have we identified at particular firms? What are those characteristics? The models are built on hundreds of data points to find these patterns, and I won't speak to modeling in terms of laying certain data points aside and then testing your models, but things like financial filings, past exam outcomes, AP information, anything from your years within the industry to turnover at a firm to honestly any data point you can think of is used, and then we identify which data points are the best predictors. What else do I have in here? So I have things like customer complaints I already mentioned. There's this concept of risk memos. I'll speak to that in just a second. Well, I could speak to it right now. Risk memos are those observations from other groups within our organization where, let's say an individual within the disclosure document team is reviewing a document and they observe a risk. It's a mechanism by which anyone within our organization can relay some observed risk to the risk group, and we then take that into account within our modeling and qualitative overview. The model development process, I already said this. The one thing seems pretty obvious, firms that have received customer complaints are more likely to have subsequent exams result in inaction. That seems rather intuitive. There are some data points, however, that are not as intuitive, and I think that's kind of the message we're trying to convey there. From an analysis standpoint, this is really my field of expertise. So what we do here is we take the model output, which is usually a score. We call it a raw propensity. It is a score that basically spits out every single firm has its own score in any registration category in which you are registered. And we take that score and then we also build data visualizations off of data that may or may not have been used within the model. And that could be things like your history of your financial filing history, your questionnaire response history, I mentioned personnel turnover, things of that nature. Any data point we have available, we try to build a picture. And what we do there, that concept of data validation, is seeing whether or not that score matches up with what we are seeing the firm's operations as being. So I kind of said earlier, you know, a firm that is trading pursuant to a tail risk strategy would be expecting X, but we currently don't collect strategy information, so we have to derive that off of things like SOI and things of that nature. So that is ways in which we analyze this data to be able to draw the best conclusions about whether or not there's a perceived risk. And I mentioned here, you know, we account for operational insights, internal, external data. We absolutely do have a team of individuals who will search and see, you know, if a firm, for example, is reporting that they're not doing business, not conducting any business, are they just not reporting that to us and conducting business externally, or is it truly that we can't find any reason to believe that they are doing business? These last 3 points, firm prioritization, data conveyance, and revaluation, I will actually touch on the next slide. So this in a nutshell is what I try to depict as a visual of our exams, risk-based exam selection process. So I mentioned this model output, those staff observations, any emergency findings, so those could be things like a customer complaint or any event we might observe. Regulatory required exams, so those of you that are an introducing broker know that if you are not in net capital compliant, or you don't have net capital and you haven't supplied a financial statement a certified financial statement within 6 months of being a member, you are going to be part of an NFA 6-month IB examination. So that's an example of a regulatory required exam. There's also FCM required exams, so that's what that entails. And then we also have ad hoc reviews, and this is where I will touch on those 3 points just very quickly. So when we identify a set number of firms for the schedule, one thing we keep in mind, of course, is that we only have a set number of staff, and we have to identify which firms should we go to in the next 3 months versus which firms can wait. And so that's one of the mechanisms by which we meet as a group. We identify those risk factors. We've identified that qualitative overview, which is usually, like I said, a data visualization of some of the observations about your operations that we have available to us. And we talk through and identify which firms should be prioritized before others. And one of the things we do thereafter is we try to convey as much of that what we think is already useful information to our exam teams. And so we also do that through a data visualization mechanism. And then we run the list of firms through our upper management before obviously they are proposed. And then once our exam teams are in the field, I kind of say, you know, at that point, the exam team becomes far more intimately familiar with a firm than I am based on the data that is available to me. And so one of the things that is extremely important is for these teams then to give us some feedback at the very, very end of that exam. You know, things like, where were those risks observed? Was this a fruitful exam? And or not. And obviously, like I mentioned earlier, we base our models off of exam outcomes, so we already have that data, whether or not there were any findings in any respective areas that we tested, but it's more of, are we really matching up the data with what it is we are proposing? And With that, I will take a couple questions.
Hi, Dorothy. Dorothy, do you have any feedback in regards to predictive models and running them in a scenario like a Peregrine, an MF Global, what's the success rate that your models are at predicting something like that?
A failure like-
Peregrine is a little different because it was straight out fraud and counterfeiting
Right.
statements and all that good stuff.
So I will say this blanketly, and that's, your models are only as good as the data you have. And I know that doesn't really answer your question, but we don't have data such as transactional data at all of our firms to be able to truly tell whether or not there's fraud going on in terms of trading or churning or things of that nature. So that's my blanket statement. Now that said, we have noticed that our models are doing a very, very good job of identifying the high-risk firms. There's obviously some room for improvement in terms of some of the lower-ranking firms. And what I mean by that is we have tested the model, so we have gone out to certain firms that have a lower risk score, and sometimes those have resulted in an action. So we're trying to obviously learn. It takes time. Most of our models, we started in 2014. We just put the GIB model into production a couple months ago. So there's an example. We have to give it time for us to identify whether or not it is being effective. But our CPO and CTA model and our IB models have been in place for enough time for us to be able to see that they are doing a very good job of, well, I should say this. When you identify whether or not a model is doing well, you're just shooting for better than random. Our models are doing better than random. That's huge. I mean, in predictive analytics, that's kind of, you pick your benchmark. Anyone else?
You mentioned arbitration complaints as one of your factors. Have you go deeper into that, looking at the merits of the case?
Sure. So what I mean by that is we have certain data points that tell us whether or not there has been an arbitration. We might not have access to the details of an arbitration, for example. We do have, so what I'm saying with that is anyone who's actually filed a complaint to our arbitration department, if it's logged, we have that data point. But there are certain things we can and cannot see. Similarly, things like exchange cases, sometimes exchanges will take for not filing timely if you're transacting in swaps, for example, and so those data points we have available. So does that answer your question?
No.
No?
I was wondering if you looked at the merits of the case. So let's say a customer files an arbitration claim. I was wondering if you looked at the merits of the case. So if a customer files an arbitration claim, and it's, let's say a customer files an arbitration claim, and the firm defends the case and prevails. Is that the filing of the case still held as a factor against?
So I'm glad you mentioned that. It's really the outcome of the case that we are using. So for example, I usually see that not in arbitrations, but in customer complaints. A customer will complain, my account was turned by X firm, right? And so we will reach out, we will ask the customer to provide us support as part of our review process. We will ask the firm to provide their support for this complaint. Obviously, if you have a customer complaint on file, you have to log it, right? You all know. So we do that analysis, and the outcome of that is what determines, it's not just that they have had one, it is what was the outcome. So the merits, I apologize, I didn't hear your initial question fully. The merits are considered.
Thanks.
Anyone else? Yeah. Just a friendly.
This is Crystal. I have a question. So some model input is, for example, a quality data, not a data, quality. How do you quantify that?
When a data point is a qualitative data point, we convert it to a number.
Can you give a brief?
So yeah,
example?
my team, that's exactly what we try to do, is that meeting that I mentioned where we speak about what are the risks, we put a score, 1, 2, 3, keep it simple, on that risk. So then you can kind of take the risk output, the model output, plus that overlay of the qualitative review and determine whether or not. So what I mean is if you have a high risk score, but after our analysis, we thought that was a 3, it's lower, we kind of know then, okay, this is lower than what the model seems to be telling us. Does that help? Anyone else? Well, thank you very much.